When families grow, it starts to become more about how do you keep the family together. My father failed in one way, which was succession planning.
We're having a conversation about stuff that really points to why businesses don't make it to the third, the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth generation, right?
If you kill the golden goose in the business, if you kill the golden goose that's laying the golden eggs, you're going to create different problems in the family. The benefit of owning a family business is to be able to do some things that would not make sense necessarily for a regular business. I promise you, everybody has an idea of what succession looks like for them. I think is much more deeper, and it's kind of an operating plan of how are we going to make decisions about this business or these shared assets that we own together.
Welcome to Disruptive Successor, a show for next generation leaders in family businesses and entrepreneurs who want to disrupt the status quo and take their existing business to a whole new level. We all know that what got us here isn't going to get us there. This show will provide inspiration, advice, and resources to help you create massive impact. This podcast is sponsored by myself, Jonathan Goldhill, and my company, the Goldhill Group, where we provide coaching for growing companies. I'm Jonathan Goldhill, and my purpose is simple: to guide entrepreneurial leaders in family businesses towards more freedom and fulfillment. I want entrepreneurs to get clarity around the changes that will make them and their businesses more successful so they can experience the same freedom I've enjoyed in my life. Our proven practices challenge business owners to think differently about their business and how they're running it, and quite literally become game changers in our clients' companies. Learn more at thegoldhillgroup.com website, where you can schedule your free strategy session.
Welcome to another episode of the Disruptive Successor Show. I'm your host, Jonathan Goldhill, and today we're examining something that almost every family business experiences, but few know how to measure, and that's the cost of unresolved conflict. Family disagreements are often treated as personal matters, something the family should resolve privately. But when those differences remain unresolved, the consequences don't stay within the family. They affect employees, employee retention, decision-making, business strategy, succession, and ultimately the value of the enterprise. Joining me again is returning guest Phelps Wood, now a senior consultant at Continuity Family Business Consulting. He appeared on episode 87 of the Disruptive Successor Show, where he shared his personal, real-world experiences and lessons learned while navigating succession in his family business. Phelps draws on his experience running a family-owned natural resource firm and leading the ownership transition of his family's business. Today, he helps enterprising families navigate the friction that arises as they and their businesses grow. My guest holds an MBA from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management and is based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Phelps, welcome back to the Disruptive Successor Show. It's great to have you back.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's nice to be back. Nice to see you again.
All right, well, let's pick up from, 4 years ago or 3.5 years ago, episode 87, for listeners who may not have heard your first appearance. Tell us briefly about your family business experience and how it shaped the work that you do today.
Sure. My family, well, I grew up in a family business, as you mentioned. It was a manufacturing business in Southern California that my father owned and ran. And I did not work in the business, at least not as an adult. I'd worked in it as a kid, as a lot of a lot of people do growing up in a business. But my father, I'd say he failed in one way, which was kind of really succession planning for that business. He had an estate plan, but he was still working in the business every day up until the day before he died, as were my two siblings. And without kind of a plan for who was going to run it and who would lead it afterward, it turned out that we didn't have the conversations that we really should have had about direction and how we would work together to move forward.
Boy, just put a pin in that right there, folks, because people would be like, well, yeah, my father's got or my parents have an estate plan, but an estate plan and a succession plan are so different. Do you want to just like tell the listeners the distinction?
Sure, sure. I mean, I look at it as an estate plan kind of tells you where the assets are going to go, and a lot of it's done for either tax purposes, if you're a quite wealthy family, or for to avoid probate,
Right.
which is that's a whole nother story. I've gone through that on a different bent, and that's no fun. But a succession plan, I think, is much more deeper, and it's kind of an operating plan of how are we going to make decisions about this business or these shared assets that we own together? Who is going to be in the room making those decisions? How do we work together to solve problems, to overcome differences that we have? There's a lot of components that can go into a succession plan. Some people think of it as ownership succession, who's going to be the owner. Also look at it as leadership succession, who's going to lead the business. Those are conversations that even if you haven't figured out a specific kind of cut and dry plan for that, at least having those conversations are important.
So every family's got a conflict style, I would say, or lack thereof. What was the conflict style of your family, Phelps?
I think my dad was, and I think I may have mentioned this in the prior one. My father was really kind of conflict averse, and I,
Mm,
I think so. One, I like to define conflict. I like to, in my current work, we spend a lot of time working with families that initially come to us because they're having troubles managing their differences. And I like to phrase
mhm.
it that way because the differences may be just a disagreement. You and I may be disagreeing about something, but if you're really conflict averse, you may see that as conflict. I may just see that as a disagreement that, is not really that severe. So my father, I think, saw what you and I would call traditional kind of business negotiation as conflictual, at least
Mm,
between family members.
mm,
So we buried a lot of stuff. We
mhm.
didn't talk about things, and that's often something that I see in my work now. I think the key words to look for is when somebody comes and says, "Well, we're kind of stuck. We can't make decisions." We like to call that passive conflict. They're not actively knocking heads or yelling at each other, but they're not able to move forward because they're not able to surface things for fear of conflict. Passive conflict's kind of maybe fear of conflict.
Yeah,
Did
that's
that
an
answer
interesting.
your question?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I can think of my own life and somehow where I've been conflict avoidant at times or in certain situations, and that can cause a failure to move forward. And if everyone's style is like that, then it'd be really difficult to move
Right,
the family forward.
right,
So, all
right.
right, so you obviously learned a lot in the last few years, and you joined Continuity, which is focused around conflict. So what have you learned since our podcast that has changed or deepened your understanding of family enterprise?
Well, I know I'm not here to sell books, but Doug Bomel, who founded Continuity, and I know you had a conversation with him some episodes past, where
Yes.
he went into some depth. Really kind of, he's an engineer by background, so he tried to break down the
Mm,
components of conflict. And so that's, part of our methodology and part of what we use. I mean, we don't plug everything into a formula and come out with a
right.
number. It doesn't work quite that way. But
Right.
I think there's really three components that we're looking for when we're talking with families, when we're onboarding them or initial engagements. And it's really, where are they with their goals? Do they have opposing goals? Is someone trying to row the boat to the left while somebody's trying to row the boat to the right? That doesn't work. Do they have values that are incompatible? Um, I mean, examples would be, we're running a business and you're very averse to adding any debt onto the business. I don't
Right.
have a problem with that. I want to grow faster. I want to use debt. We look at those as values. And so they're incompatible. You can't have, so how do you manage that? How do you come to some type of compromise? And then the third piece is really what we would call historical impasses. I think,
Hmm.
most people just call that baggage.
Right.
Something, you broke my toys when I was a kid. I still don't like that about you. Or I was the older son and you felt that I was favored. Those are a little longer term pieces that have to be worked through, but you've got to surface those issues to bring them up. Sometimes it can be more, business related. So you were passed over for a job, or you felt you were. You get paid more than I do, and I'm uptight about that. There's a lot of pieces that fold into it, but we're trying to break down what the family, kind of how the family works and where people are to understand how we can address each of those components.
What I love about the model and the whole notion that conflict affects enterprise value is that it pairs so well with Pat Lencioni's philosophy around teamwork, and that teamwork is like the ultimate competitive advantage. And so when a family plays well together and works well together, they can really build a very powerful enterprise. And when they don't, they can really destroy enterprise value. So we're going to get into how it gets destroyed in a few moments, but
No,
um,
can I add one thing to what you
yeah,
just said?
please. Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. And the family businesses, the families that do that well, the families that are aligned in their vision for the business, family businesses outperform non-family businesses financially over the
Mm,
long term. And that patient capital, what they call patient capital, those family members who are invested, both actually literally invested
right.
monetarily, but also invested emotionally in the business, even if they're not owners, family members who see this legacy as important to carry on. They're just a tremendous asset. They're probably an off-balance sheet asset, but they're a
Right.
tremendous asset to the business. And so those are kind of the non-financial components that add to the financial piece for families who are running these businesses well and managing the relationships across their families well.
So I want to get into the tangible cost of unresolved conflict, but I'm struggling with something first, which is conflict itself the problem, or is the real problem the family's inability to address and manage conflict? Maybe that's just a
We,
conundrum
yeah,
question.
I would argue continuity that it's the inability to manage conflict
Yeah.
because
Uh,
conflict is inherent in a family business. You've got interdependent an interdependent situation where family members and the business are reliant on each other. I mean, if you back out of the business piece, conflict's inherent in a family. Um, Kids, push against their parents to be able to grow and kind of learn how to develop. Parents kind of trade off that how much leash do we give our kid and how much do we rein them in? And so, again, defining conflict as a spectrum. I see those as kind of closer, less kind of urgent to address. Those are kind of the typical, kind of
mhm.
disagreements, I guess, or differences that go on in a family. But an inability to talk about those and address those is kind of what over time creates a bit of a cancer. And that can be very destructive.
So, I mean, does a family have to get into the emotional realm? Do they have to go through the historical impasse issues that you described or alluded to earlier to resolve these and to improve the performance of the business, or can they kind of skip over that and like, I mean, how do they get to the healthy conflict decision making? It just and just one more thought is, I mean, in most of the businesses that I've worked with, usually one sibling of the arises as the leader, this the heir apparent, the CEO, and then the other one's kind of like, I'm not so sure this is what I want to be doing because um, my brother or whatever wants to take on too much risk. I'm not, I want to grow slower. So, I think this is a really challenging area for businesses. Anyway.
And you brought up a couple different topics in there. I'll take the last one first, which is just sometimes there doesn't feel like there's room. for more than one person to be involved. And and I think what the trap that some families fall into is they're looking backward of how was this done before, and this is often a trap that the that founders, fall into is I had this experience.
Right.
This next generation will have to have that experience to be able to move this forward. And that's kind of I think, it's one of the quotes that you talk about is what got us here won't get us there. And
Right.
that's important to know. Certainly somebody who grew a business from zero to $50 million is very different than the person that's needed to grow that business from $50 million to $250 million. Probably very different than what you need to run the business today at $50 million. That they just haven't
Mhm.
identified that. So that's one piece of it. You also mentioned, there's family members who maybe aren't interested in kind of working in the business or the nuts and bolts of the business. And we deal with a lot of families, businesses that are quite large. And there's room in other areas that are ancillary, that are important to the family. Because when families grow, it starts to become more about how do you keep the family together? The business itself is operating. It may even have non-family members running it at times. But the important piece then is the owners of these businesses, the shareholders, which are family members. How do you keep them engaged? How do you keep those relationships tight when people are growing and moving all over the country or all over the world? And that's a little bit of a different problem. And that's where there's some other components that may come in, whether it be, uh, philanthropic efforts that they can do together, regardless of the business. Uh, I mean, even just getting together annually in some type of retreat and having fun.
Right.
It doesn't have to be business focused. Those are all things that families that I've seen that are successful are spending time and effort to make sure that they happen.
Well, my background is that I've not worked in very large multi-generational families, but I've worked in some very large community-based organizations, and conflict can really slow down decision making, even the smallest conflict, because it might be a procedural or a process conflict, it might be a personality conflict, there's a power play. I can only imagine how it slows down in a large multi-generational family business where some family members are operating members and some are not in the operating
Sure.
business. So could you describe maybe what that looks like inside of a leadership or ownership group at maybe one of your clients or a typical client?
Sure, sure. Well, so there's a family that I've been working with for several years, and it's very tightly owned. There's four owners, even though it's a third generation family, and they have what I would call a work to own model. So you have to work in the business to be an owner. That's why ownership is so concentrated. Um, it's not a bad model, but for a business this size, it's a pretty big business, 1,000 employees, probably over $500 million value business. It starts to present some different types of problems, especially from an estate planning standpoint. But what we found with this family is they were going through some conflict, and exactly what you just mentioned is it slowed down decision making. They own a bunch of different businesses that are all kind of, I'll call it they're all kind of interrelated, and they'd acquired a lot of these, but they weren't really able to integrate them well because they couldn't make the decisions around how are we going to integrate them? Do we integrate them? That kind of stepped on toes of one of the family members who was running kind of a unit of the business. And to be honest, the family in the past had kind of siloed up because they'd had disagreements. And so brothers didn't want to work for another brother. They wanted to run their own thing. And they were tremendously successful from a business standpoint, but they're at a size now where they've got to kind of change the way that that happens. And they've got to be able to communicate and get aligned around a direction for it.
Gotcha.
So those decisions were not happening because they were in such disagreement.
Mm,
And it, to be honest, was kind of an existential threat for the business.
sure, sure. All right, let's see if we can put some real numbers around the cost of conflict. I know that's probably challenging, but what expenses, lost opportunities, valuation factors would you examine? Do you have any
Sure.
data on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's going to differ for every business, but I think one of the examples I like to use is just it's just the cost of replacing people who walk out the
Sure,
door. There's,
sure.
there's often, I mean, I tell you, your A players, I mean, you want to hire A players, right? And your A players will very quickly leave if they find that they're not being supported or they're not able to achieve, what they want to achieve within the organization. And often when a non-family member shows up at a business and finds that either things are moving very slowly or they weren't really told the whole story, or they're not able to achieve their goals within the business because of a lack of decision making by family members or that, they'll walk out the door. And they say that it costs 150% to 200% of that person's salary, yearly salary to replace them. So if you've got an employee making
At the executive level, we're talking about, correct?
yeah, we're talking at the executive level. It might cost more than that. I'll give you an example
Right,
of where it's a lot more expensive than that, than executive level. But I mean, let's use an example of somebody who's a very, very good salesperson. By the way, salespeople are pretty
right,
mobile, right? So
right.
when you lose a salesperson, you're losing not only whatever, it's going to cost to replace them, which is going to be costly, but they're not selling when they're gone, and if they have relationships that are specific to them, you run the risk of a different
Sure,
factor, which is
sure.
that they take those relationships with them, and maybe some of the internal difficulties at your business or the family difficulties of your business get communicated to those relationships, which I think is a different cost and problem because it's hard to win those back.
Yeah.
Dollar
So,
wise, I mean, I can walk you through a little bit of that. You mentioned sea level
mhm.
loss. Worked with a company where their CTO left. So that CTO was executive level, obviously, their chief technology officer, making I think close to $200,000 a year. So probably in the range of 300 to 400,000 in it cost to replace that person. But more importantly, that CTO was in charge of integrating data, kind of data systems and ERP enterprise systems across this business that were going to save kind of $3+ million a year ongoing for this business. All of that 3 million drops to the bottom line if you get those
Right.
savings. But as soon as he left,
Got,
all that work stops.
got put on hold. Unbelievable. Yeah. So it's it's hard to quantify these things, but the multiplication factor is pretty big. And it's just that's just one example. I think every example would be different. Um, so there's a lot of warning signs that other advisors, wealth managers, business advisors, estate planners, I mean, they might get a hint of, but they miss the warning signs in these families that there's business conflict, that it's kind of remained hidden beneath maybe politeness or avoidance or apparent agreement or well, you don't need to talk to my son or daughter. I'll just be the only one making the decision here. I mean, you know, and one of the things that again Lencioni talks about is that artificial harmony.
Mhm.
And in a business where you don't really have conflict, you never argue. Is that healthier than arguing openly? I mean, you can see the two extremes. Um,
You want to get to a point where you can disagree agreeably, right? You
right,
probably heard that term. And so, and ideally, and that's, I mean, I'll be honest, that's one of the areas spent a lot of time with families is facilitating conversations. And so conversations between family members can quickly drag in a lot of those components that I mentioned earlier, historical baggage or that. So how can you help family members and non-family members communicate in a way that is productive, um, and kind of get to the facts, lower the emotional level of these, normalize the fact that people are going to disagree at times, or that New ideas, can be vetted without threat to people. Um, it's it's touchy depending on where people lie at the get-go, but it can be done. It can be done. And you brought up some of the warning factors that you
Yeah.
walked through. I don't know if you want me to expand on those, but
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I see a lot and in personal relationships is what I call, or what psychologists call triangulations, which is where, person A goes to talk to person B about the issue they're having with person C. And that makes things worse between A and C.
yeah.
Um, so that's really unhealthy conflict. And I think also, Phelps, is that the older people are, the more hardened they are in their emotional behaviors. And so the more difficult it is to change those people.
Without a doubt, without a doubt. And I think, the solutions to some of these things is in a family business is often it's not just one or the other. It's not just structural change. I think that's where some advisors kind of fall short is to say, well, here's some best practices. This is what you need to do. You need to implement a board. A board will make your decisions, or you need to have this kind of process. And those certainly can be helpful. In fact, we spend a lot of time, working with families to initiate those things, but there's not a blanket kind of prescription for everybody. And really a best practices, we often think that the best practices for your business have yet to be written because your business and your family are unique.
Good
Um,
point.
but so there are some structural issues that you can address. And then there's also some personal growth that may need to happen. That happens a little slower generally than structural issues. I mean, once people align
Sure.
around a structural change, you can generally make that happen quickly. Personal change takes more time. But a lot of time we're just trying to get the boat pointed in the right direction.
So let's just define what you mean by structural change, because I'm thinking we're moving Johnny into the CTO seat, and he's been in a CIO seat or CFO seat. Is that an example of a type of structural change, or
Kind
we're
of,
going to
that's
or we're having meetings? We're going to now have a family business meeting once a month. We're going to have an ownership team meeting once a quarter, and we're going to have reports that come out in advance. I mean, so tell us more about what
Yeah,
you're
I
thinking.
think, I mean, I think those are, especially that latter part are effective. I mean, being able to helping people understand that, okay, we're gonna have an ownership meeting, so we're all wearing our ownership hat today.
Yep.
We're gonna have a business meeting that's more operational, and that's gonna be restricted to the people who are busy making those decisions. It may or may not be the same people in the other room. Um, More large scale, and the company that I mentioned that I mentioned had this work to own model. So we
Hmm.
saw that work to own model as a structural as something that exacerbated the friction between family members. All right, and
Interesting.
I'll tell you why, and that is because if you have to work to own, if you no longer work at that business, so if you get laid off or fired,
You no
or
longer own.
die for that
Yeah.
matter,
Right.
then you no longer get to own shares. And
Uh,
if you die, guess what happens? Well, the business buys out your shares. So it created a structural issue in two ways. One, by the way, the company already had a ton of debt on it from buying out family members who had exited in the past, some of their own accord, some because they were pushed
mhm.
out. But it's an existential threat for a family member. If I have to work in this business to be an owner and I get fired, or I want to leave because I want to do something else, I give up my shares. And that means my kids won't be owners. I don't know what their path is into the business if they have one. Um, that's structurally a problem that exacerbates any type of friction that's there. Because if you're
Mm.
using that as a threat or you're concerned about that, it's a whole nother level. So that was something that we recommended. We really spent a lot of time talking about what changes would look like and really spent actually the last 2 years with this family changing that over time. And it is changed now. And in fact, we believe it enables them to continue to be this multi-generational business that will
Mm.
be owned by future generations. Some of those generations may decide that they want to exit ownership, and there's a pathway to do that. But the hopes are that most of them want to stay in the business. Does that give you a
So
little bit of a idea from a
yeah, I'm
structural
trying to
standpoint?
understand a little bit that, I mean, I get the word to own. It seems like they should have continued to own once they already worked and earned ownership. But I'm kind of not clear on what the agreement or lack of agreement or disagreement looked like within that enterprise. And maybe more generally, when does normal disagreement become a threat to business continuity?
Well, I think that that family had kind of all three components that I mentioned. So there were some people with different goals. They had some incompatible values, and they had a lot of history. And plus, there's another component that factors into this, not just in this family, but in other families, which is grief. I mean, some of these families have lost family members, either parents that died young or family members who met tragic ends. If a family isn't good at talking about things, they probably haven't spent a lot of time talking about those things. And people making decisions while they're grieving is tough. And I speak from my own experience. I mean, when we spoke, last, my father had passed away, I think 3 years before that. I had started working with my own family 2 years after his death. And I think my brother and sister and I were all still affected by his passing. Um, and you don't make good decisions when you're under stress, and grief is a level of stress that I think people underestimate. So there's multi factors
Yeah.
in the example I was giving you. Um,
So the other thought is, and like this also comes up personally, is that what's being argued about is not really what you're arguing about. In other words, it's not the real source of conflict. And how important is it in your model, in your work, to understand the root causes of the conflict?
Yeah, it's essential, right? It's essential. That's why we try to break it down into these components. I mean, I think, the question is what's the problem behind the problem, right?
Right,
And so we're
right.
constantly kind of digging at that in a lot of different ways. I mean, one of the things that, when we're, we often we don't like it when families vote, because voting, unless everybody votes, unless it's unanimous, voting has losers. And if it's the same loser over and over again, they start to harbor resentment.
Right,
So we like to
right.
run what we call a consensus building process. And so
Mm,
it's really, we're trying to get everybody above the line, so to speak. Um, and while we're doing that, we're trying to understand, if you say, I don't want to put on debt. I don't want debt on the company. So that's a position, and my argument would be, okay, Jonathan, I understand that's your position. What is the interest behind that position, right? And this is a common kind of mediation or negotiation technique. But really getting to that interest-based piece of what's driving that, and what is it? Sometimes it's emotional. And sometimes it's hard to get that out because you haven't thought about it enough. It is an emotional component, and it's hard to put emotional pieces into words. But when you can get to the level where you say it's just emotional, it concerns me, then we can start looking at solutions, right? Well, what would make you feel better? Well, in what circumstances could you do that? Is there a way we can put some safeguards on that would make you comfortable? Can we baby step into this? Um, and we're trying to work it at every angle. I mean, to be honest, you got to
Sounds
find
like it.
something that works. But did that address your question? Or I feel
Yeah,
like I
yeah.
missed it a
And
little bit, but
it seems that these disputes, the common ones might be around compensation of family members or business strategy. What direction, do we go into a new market? Do we expand into this product? Um, and along with business strategy, there's financial strategies and operating strategies, and then job titles probably also
I mean,
come up.
look, I've seen families that every family member in the business gets paid the same amount,
Yes.
and for some families that works, and for some families that doesn't work. I've seen it where families get paid on merit and the position and they market to market rates, et cetera. And that would seem to make sense. That works very well for some families, doesn't work for others. So, it's this question of, in a business, a business is a meritocracy. So ideally, people who work hard and perform are the ones that rise to the top. In a family, family kind of everybody's treated equally. So if you come into a business with the family mentality of I'm going to be treated equally, but you're not performing, either way you go, you're going to create a problem. If you pay that person the same as the CEO is going to be ticked off. If you don't pay them, you pay them on kind of what they're producing, they're going to look at the CEO, who's their brother, and say, "Why don't I get the same thing as Jonathan?" Um, then you start to get into kind of how do you manage expectations across that. And going
Yeah.
back to your
Yeah.
structure, so some of this is you've got to work at this over time, but we spend a lot of time drafting family employment policies for families.
Mhm.
And we're doing that with the whole family, ideally, not just the ones that are in the business, but that family employment policy has got to work for the family, but it certainly has to work for the business. Um, if you kill the golden goose of the business, if you kill the golden goose that's laying the golden eggs, you're going to create different problems in the family. Um, but at the same time, we used to joke in my family that, there were four siblings. There were the three of us in the business, not necessarily in that order. Um, but I
Right.
promise you that at the end of the day, if my dad had been given kind of the Sophie's choice of, shoot one of these, he would have, well, I hope he would have kept the kids and shot the business,
Got the
right?
business. Right.
But most families want to make sure that they continue as a family. And to be honest, those are the people that come to me
Or-
now through
Right.
continuity are
Right.
families who have gotten to a point, business owning families have gotten to a point where they are concerned about losing their family.
Right.
The
Right. I
business
mean,
may
one
be rolling along fine, actually. A lot of times the business is doing fine.
Interesting. Yeah, one of my guests framed this up a while back and said, here's the question I always ask clients first is, are you a family first business or a business first family? And it's kind of an interesting choice that you have to make. So,
It's
so
interesting you bring that up. I'm working with a family that said that they shifted, that in our conversations with them, they said, well, we changed X amount of years ago from a family business to a business family. And
right.
I would ask, well, what does that mean? And I got a lot of different definitions from
Yeah,
people.
sure.
And I'd make the argument to you that at some point you've got to do both. That you've got to understand. I mean, you have to make sure that the business is running well and that it's run like a business. But the benefit of owning a family business is to be able to do some things that would not make sense necessarily for a regular business. I'm not saying employ all your unemployable family members in it. That's probably not a great idea. Um, but hey, we've got to make a distribution to help the family versus reinvesting this year. We want to be able to support these causes that are very dear to us in the community that may not have a financial return to us, but take
Right.
care of stakeholders, whether they're family members or others, that are important to us. And those are decisions that families make with their wealth or with their business. Um, that also kind of bring family together.
Let's talk about conflict during succession. So, right, succession often brings dormant family tensions to the surface
Yeah.
because leadership, identity, ownership, and money, they all converge all at once. And so, you know, this is a conundrum, I think, as a family approaches a leadership or ownership transition. Conflict shows up, I think, even more. Is that your experience?
That is, and I think it's like anything where there's uncertainty. There's a lot of concern and stress around the uncertainty, and so for families who don't have a clear path, or because they can't talk about what succession looks like, I promise you, everybody has an idea of what succession looks like for them.
Yeah.
The chances that it's aligned, if they haven't spoken about it, is rare. Um, and again, going back to that point of if you're waiting around for if you're waiting around for the senior kind of the senior generation to step down and they're in their late 70s, 80s, the chances are that they won't step down and that death will be the triggering event for the succession. And now you've got
Yeah.
an unplanned succession. You've also got grief thrown in there. It's not a great equation. Um,
And these are not your clients, I take it, because they don't come, if they're coming based on the name alone of continuity for like family
yeah,
business.
they are. I mean, some
They-
people look. It's never too early to start planning for succession. It's also never too late.
Oh, that's
But the
different.
later you go, the more your options constrict, I think.
Right.
And that I would include that. I mean, I had a call earlier today around estate planning. I mean, that's another component of it is you got a really large business. Time is on your side. Time is your friend from an estate planning standpoint. But when you run out of time at the end there, you really limit your options from an estate planning standpoint to avoid having to kind of give up either fair amount of a fair amount of cash from a tax standpoint, or even being able to keep the company in the family if it's that egregious.
Yeah. So, some quick takeaways that you might have for listeners, like how can families create a healthy process for raising concerns and disagreeing with one another, or do they just need to go right to the family business consultant or get a mediator or a therapist or some combination of professionals? I mean, what's
Yeah,
maybe
I
a
I think
quick
it depends on what. Yeah, I think it depends on what's going on. I mean, I think each of those kind of advisors has their different area. I think one is getting advisors that are outside of your current advisors is often helpful. I mean, if you're paying accountants or you're paying lawyers already, they're either used to where you are or they don't want to be fired by telling you some of the things that you may need to hear. I think that's the benefit of hiring a third party. I mean, to be honest, that's kind of one of our big benefits is telling people kind of the tough news, breaking the tough news to them in a gentle manner, and that there is a path forward. I think we mentioned you mentioned mediators or therapists. Like we don't do therapy. Therapy, I think of as that, but although we will team up with therapists, if that's the case, we do have some people that work at Continuity who have, psychology background, so they're bringing that, but we're not actually engaging in therapy during our process. Um, for some families who have deep-seated issues that they've gone through, or there might need to be some additional therapy outside of the work that we do. As far as mediators go, we use a lot of mediation techniques, I would say, to make sure people are heard. But mediation generally functions well for disputes. Doesn't function as well at what we're working with, which is what we would call identity-based conflict. We mentioned kind of how you grow up, how you see yourself in the family and in the world. Um, that needs a more nuanced kind of multi-skilled approach. Um,
not something they can do themselves, in other words, right? Or not
I
easily.
mean, look, self-help books are been successful for a reason. I think it works for
Yeah.
some people, but
Right.
but it's not only about yourself. It's about the other. It's a matrixed organization, right? I mean, how you relate to your parents, how you relate to your siblings or your cousins. That takes a lot more. That takes a lot more work, and often you need a little bit of help doing that.
Look, I mean, we're having a conversation about stuff that really points to why businesses don't make it to the third, the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth generation, right? I mean, and it's not just conflict, right? There's outside forces that are a change in the market, like whether those be political or international or technological or whatever those types of things. And if you're not adapting or adjusting to those, um, the end is near in sight for sure, right? But if you're also postponing these conversations until the founder's death or their health is so bad, or you're just not dealing with these conversations, this explains to me a lot why family businesses may be arguably the strongest of all businesses, but also have a difficulty of making it past a few generations. Just my thought.
No, I think you're right. And I think we're always looking for, I think Doug talked about this and maybe with you is this kind of family factor. And we kind of define that as how willing are these families to, really to collaborate, to forgive, to commit to change. That's really important. And you're trying to build those skill sets in every generation. And that's the long game, really. And so if you can play the long game in this area, then you can really set yourself up for success. And if you're playing catch up, then I think you really have to reach out to some people to help kind of accelerate that process.
All right, let's go into a lightning round, if you will. I gave you some practical scenario questions. Hopefully maybe you can look at those, and let's grab a few of them. Do you?
Sure. Is there one that jumps out? Let me see if I can.
I mean, the one that really interests me, I think, is scenario three, the underperforming family employee, right? A next generation family member is underperforming, but no one is willing to confront the issue. Like, what's the cost of allowing that to continue?
Oh, the cost of allowing that to continue is obviously underperformance in whatever that person's role is. So, I mean, we talked
Right.
earlier, if they're head of sales and you're not selling anything, that's kind of a problem. If you're in an area, if you're in a regulated business or something that's got a lot of risk and that person is running some division of that or some component of that, that's a whole nother level of problem. Um, but I think there's knock-on effect problem, right? Which is, all right, well, Phelps isn't performing, and yet he's getting paid XYZ, or we have to pull his weight, or we have to cover for him. It starts to breed resentment, across the family. It becomes probably even more difficult to kind of address. Um, I guess I'd back up though too. Sometimes the onus is not only on that person. The question is, all right, well, do you have kind of very clear parameters for how Phelps is supposed to perform? Like, does he have a clear role definition? Does he know what his key performance indicators are?
Right, right.
Does he have any reviews? I mean, what type of review process do you have? And so you try not to put all the onus on the individual. The individual may well be underperforming. But in a family business, my argument would be, all right, well, how do we support that person to perform at a higher level? That's the benefit that you have in a family business is, well, maybe he needs a little more education, or maybe he needs a specific, kind of instruction or class in some way. Maybe he needs a coach,
Yeah.
a personal coach. So there's some ways to address it. Again, this is, high level. I don't know the specifics,
No,
but
but you pointed to the structural stuff first as what needs to be like, do we have structure in place that measures performance, clarifies what his roles and his accountability? Those things are super important. And
yeah,
a lot of times the problems dissolve
yeah,
once that gets clarified. And it's really important that those metrics, those accountabilities are not specific to him or
yeah,
her, but specific to the position and what's needed. So,
exactly. No.
yeah. Well, uh, surprise question. What's your favorite movie or television series or show around family business? Do you have one?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen all the more recent ones, that people are talking about, kind of Succession, Yellowstone, et cetera. I go back to one that I watched. I was actually at the time, my father was running his business, and I was trying to talk with him, trying to get him to address some succession issues. It's called 6 Feet Under, which was an
Oh, yeah.
HBO show about a mortuary, family-owned mortuary where the father died, and kind of one of the brothers came back to help out. And it was a combination of, it had a small component of family business, but it had a lot of humor, a lot of morbid humor, as you can imagine, the
Right.
mortuary. I don't know, it struck the right tone for me at the time. So I think of that one quite a bit.
Did you share that with your dad?
No,
Did
I
you have him
didn't. I
watch?
don't. I never did actually. I never did have a chance. I don't think we were talking about TV shows at the time.
Gotcha.
But
So, I was going to ask you as a closing question, what's one conversation every family business should have before conflict arises? But I'm thinking that, maybe they should watch a movie. You should watch a movie together around the issues that you're dealing with. One of the first consulting workshops that I became familiar with when I first started my consulting career decades ago was the consultant would run the television program or the movie 12 Angry Men. And there was another one, it was a leadership movie. It was, I think, High Noon. And it would talk about leadership styles. So, when we're looking at something outside of ourselves,
yeah.
and yet now it's become something maybe we can have a conversation about afterwards.
I think so. I was thinking of the other one that's great is Arrested Development, if you've watched that, because that's just,
No.
oh my God, that's just purely, it's high humor and it's just purely dysfunctional. It's about a family and the family owned business, but it's mostly about a family. A friend of mine once said that family businesses are Shakespeare. And so, I would argue that you want to be the history. You don't want to be the comedy or the tragedy, but you got to work at that. So, I think family businesses have all the components of Shakespeare's, greatest works in them.
Well, I hope they're not like Homer's The Odyssey, because it would be quite a long journey back to a healthy place. Hey, Phelps, this is fabulous. What you're doing is great. Thank you for returning to the show and helping us make the cost of family conflict even more visible and concrete. I think the key takeaway is that conflict is not just a family matter. When it remains unresolved, it can affect decisions, talent, succession, growth, and enterprise value. Addressing those conflicts early is not an admission that the family is failing or falling apart. It's part of a responsible family business leadership plan to do such. So to our listeners, if this conversation brought to mind issues inside your family enterprise, don't wait until a crisis forces the conversation. Start while the family still has choices, time, and goodwill. And contact myself, Phelps, or Continuity for some assistance. And Phelps, thanks again for joining us today.
Hey, great to be on here, Jonathan. Thanks for having me again. Really enjoyed
All
it.
right. We'll look forward to staying in touch.
This podcast is sponsored by myself, Jonathan Goldhill, and my company, the Goldhill Group, where we provide coaching for growing companies. I'm Jonathan Goldhill, and my purpose is simple: to guide entrepreneurial leaders in family businesses towards more freedom and fulfillment. I want entrepreneurs to get clarity around the changes that will make them and their businesses more successful so they can experience the same freedom I've enjoyed in my life. Our proven practices challenge business owners to think differently about their business and how they're running it, and quite literally become game changers in our clients' companies. Learn more at thegoldhillgroup.com website, where you can schedule your free strategy session. Thank you for joining us on the Disruptive Successor Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, review, and share with a friend who would benefit from the message. If you're interested in picking up a copy of my book, Disruptive Successor, go to disruptivesuccessor.com.